go. Great, okay. And just to let you all know that Matt and Dee have kindly also shared a copy of the PowerPoint with us, and we'll be sending that out to everyone who registered after the session. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Dee Arp and Matt Wingfield, and thank you both very much for participating in this AEA Europe SIG. I'll hand over to you and more from me a bit later. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Mary, for that introduction, and welcome everybody, and thank you all for coming along to this session where we are really going to be focused on talking about the process of rethinking assessment from a 21st century perspective, I guess, thinking how technology can help us transform the assessments that we deliver, and touch on a number of things, I think, through the presentations around how technology can be an enabler, how it can introduce greater resilience to the assessment process, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the motivations for change that have taken place and taken us on this journey that many of us have experienced during the recent pandemic. And then also look at it from the perspective of how we deliver maximum value for the learner, because at the end of the day, the learner is what this is all about. We want to make sure that they have the best chance of achieving their best performance through their assessments. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. I'm sharing the stage today with Dee Arp, who's Chief Operating Officer from NEBOSH, and I'll pass over to Dee a little bit later in the presentation, where she can talk more about the work that NEBOSH have been doing in this area. But if I just give you a quick overview of what we're hoping to talk about today, please do put questions into the chat area if you do have questions as we go through. We'll finish off with plenty of time to spare, hopefully, for proper questions and at the end of the session. But please do put them in the chat if you've got them as we're going along. So the first part of the session is really going to be looking at some of the motivations behind some of the changes that we've seen, and I'll be exploring a little bit about that. I'll also be looking at some examples of best practice that I've come across as I've been looking into the market over these last few months for examples of innovation and the use of technology. So I'll share some of that. And then I'm going to pass over to Dee, who's going to talk to you about NEBOSH's journey in this respect, and specifically around transforming their exams from a closed book assessment approach to an open book assessment approach. And as I say, we'll wrap up with the opportunity to ask questions at the end. So that's what we're going to be doing. I suppose I should start before I launch into my slides to talk a little bit, tell you who I am, for those of you who don't know me. So my name is Matt Wingfield. I'm an independent consultant working in the e-assessment sector. I also chair the e-assessment association, which, if you've not come across the association, is a not-for-profit organisation that's all about promoting and supporting best practice in the use of technology to support assessment. I'll give you the link to the e-assessment association at the end of the presentation, but it's completely free to become a member. So if this is an area that you're interested in, then I would encourage you to go to the website and join up. As I say, it's free to join, and it's a great community that tries to support and nurture best practice in this space. And I guess through my role with the assessment association and working as an independent consultant, I've come across a lot of good examples of how technology has been able to be used to deliver assessments and support assessments in all different parts of the education sector. And that's, as I say, what I'm going to touch a little bit on today. But before I do that, I wanted to reflect a little bit on the current approaches that we take to assessment and the increasing number of calls that we're seeing in the sector for a change to that process to bring us more in line with the needs of the 21st century. And I think one of the key drivers behind all of this is ensuring that what we're doing is delivering and meeting the needs of the learner in their journey, whether that's at the start of their journey and going through the school system and the college system and the university system, or whether that's once they're in work, helping them to continue to build and develop their own professional journey. And in my mind, there are two real drivers behind the calls for change in the way that we approach assessment in the majority of cases at the moment. And I think those, as I summarize on the screen there, really revolve around the current assessment approaches are often not really fit for purpose because they are a one-size-fits-all approach. We assume, which of course is a wrong assumption, that the assessment will work for everybody equally, and that the one assessment, the single assessment event, covers all of their needs. And often that's not the case, whether that's because learners aren't quite ready for that assessment, or whether they've been ready for several months and are now bored and twiddling their thumbs in their learning, in waiting for the assessment to take place. We need to create much more personalized approaches to assessment, and we need to engage the learner in that assessment process. So I'm a teacher in my background, as it were, my training, and I've long been a believer that the approach to the assessment that we often take is fundamentally wrong, because the assessment is something that is done to the student or to the learner, rather than involving them in that process and enabling them to have buy-in to the assessment process, which is a much more enriching and much more engaging way of approaching things. And technology can be a real enabler here, can be a real enabler to deliver a personalized approach to the assessment. So that's the first driver in my mind. The second is that the assessment systems that we have particularly in schools, are not very good at assessing those higher order thinking skills that employers are increasingly wanting students to develop good practice in. So that's things like collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving, those kinds of skills. They're not very good at doing that typically. And a multiple choice exam scenario is not, I think anyway, not very good at eliciting insight into the skills that those students have in those areas. So those are the two drivers, I think, in my mind, for all of the calls for change that we're seeing. And again, sort of, this is a personal view, what I think we need is a much more blended approach as we move forward with our assessment regime, one that embraces and joins up the formative side of the assessment journey with the summative side of the assessment journey, so that we're not just doing a summative test to students when we think they're ready, but we're using formative assessment in a meaningful and personalized way to understand the student's journey towards that summative gateway, so that we know that they're ready for the summative assessment and they can take it when they're ready, rather than waiting to a predefined window if that's what we want. But having that much clearer joining up between formative and summative can make a big difference. And again, as I'll illustrate through a few examples in a minute, technology can really help us to deliver that at scale, because that's one of the problems and challenges, I think, with formative assessment, is it is difficult to deliver at scale if you're doing it manually. The other thing, I think, which goes back to these higher order thinking skills, and I know Dee is going to touch a little bit on this when she talks about Nibosh's journey, is that often the assessments that we deliver are just testing knowledge recall. And that's something that was pertinent and still is pertinent in certain areas, but it's not the whole picture. And what's increasingly being asked of learners is to demonstrate how they apply knowledge into their learning or working environment. And so our assessments should be trying to do that too. And the increasing move to open book assessment, which again, Dee is going to talk about a little bit later on, is a great way of doing that, because we take the focus away from just getting the student to recall lots of facts, but actually getting them instead to apply the knowledge that they've got, or the knowledge that they find, because obviously this is the world of social media and the World Wide Web. There's lots of information out there. Students need to be challenged to find the correct information and apply that to the learning that they've had and to the scenarios that they're being presented with. So we need to utilize the technology to deliver this at scale and to allow the learners to interact with the assessments in a way that's fit for purpose for where they're going and for the learning journey that they've been on. And obviously technology can also introduce greater resilience when we face challenges like the pandemic that we've just all or are still living through and hopefully coming out of the other side of now, which of course has significantly impacted on the education sector, both in terms of learning delivery and assessment. So technology can help with all of this. And what I want to do is just illustrate some of my thinking here through a few examples of projects that I'm aware of. And when the slides are shared afterwards, there are links to further information about all of the stuff that I'm going to talk to here in the notes within the slides. And I'll also share those links within the chat area at the end of the presentation. So don't worry about trying to go away and Google all of this stuff on your own. I'll provide the links to some of this stuff afterwards. So on the screen now, we've got some really good examples of how technology is being used to scale up a personalized, contextualized delivery of assessment. Because I think that, we've talked about personalization. Contextualization is also incredibly important to help the learner understand why you're assessing them on the things that they are and why the things that they're learning are important. So we need to contextualize what we're assessing around the student's experience and the expectation of the student in the workplace or in their next step in education. Really good examples here. So the national tests in Wales, I know that Gavin Reno from Alpha Plus, who Alpha Plus have led this project with the Welsh Government, has presented at the AEA Europe conference in the past about this project. But it's a really excellent example, for those of you who aren't aware, of how computer adaptive testing has been launched into the school sector in Wales, covering all schools in Wales, primary and secondary, in all parts of Wales, even the remotest rural areas, where the students are able to use these computer adaptive tests and their teachers to get a better understanding of where they are on their learning journey, where the gaps in their knowledge around English and mathematics in particular are, and then being able to address those. And the interesting thing here with these national tests is, from the government's perspective, they're seeing them finally, from a government perspective, seeing these national tests as formative rather than summative sticks around which to measure or beat up schools on their performance. These national tests in Wales are very centered on the learner's journey, the learner progression, and supporting that. And for that, I think it's a fantastic example of how large-scale assessment can be delivered in a way that supports that journey. The other thing I wanted to highlight is the use of e-portfolios. Now, this isn't new, and it's quite common in further and higher education institutions, and in some contexts within the workplace. But they really represent a fantastic way of capturing much greater insight into the broader range of skills that students are capable of. And in particular, the soft skills that we referred to earlier on, really great ways of capturing evidence around that. And there's some fantastic examples of e-portfolios being used at scale. And one particular one that always comes up in my mind is an organization called Pebble Learning, who are based at the University of Wolverhampton, who deliver a higher education e-portfolio, which is also now being used to support apprenticeship delivery. So a really good example of how e-portfolios can be utilized to support that wider context of assessment of 21st century skills or broader sets of skills. I think any presentation at the moment that, around e-assessment that doesn't mention remote invigilation and remote proctoring is probably lacking somewhat. And it's a whole topic that we could dive into in a webinar all of its own. But the increasing use of remote invigilation, particularly over the last 12 months during the pandemic, has been significant. But for me, I mean, even prior to the pandemic, I see this as a really interesting and innovative use of technology to support assessment, because it delivers so much more flexibility and accessibility. And by that, I mean accessibility in a much broader market reach context for assessment. It allows assessments to be delivered just in time when a learner's ready to be assessed, rather than them having to wait to come into a physically invigilated assessment event. Obviously, it increases resilience in time of challenge, like it has done in the pandemic. Now, clearly, it's not a panacea that offers a solution for everything, and there are challenges that need to be met through the use of remote proctoring and invigilation. And you do have to think about the process and how that maps across to a remotely delivered assessment event. But it can offer significant benefit. And so there are some really good examples out there of where remote invigilation and proctoring have been used to great effect. And then the final one that I mentioned there is the open book assessments, which we've seen huge increase in over the last 12 months. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because Dee will talk more about NEBOSH's experience here. But they are ideal for testing how students can apply the knowledge that they've gained through a learning experience into a contextualized example of their workplace or a problem that relates to the workplace or a learning environment. And offer much flexibility in that respect. And again, as Dee will talk about, offer flexibility in terms of delivery because they are not subject to quite the same, I suppose, the rigid ways that we have to deliver closed book assessments. And in all of this, I mean, those projects that I've talked about are mostly aimed at the learners and the students, but let's not forget about the teachers and tutors, the trainers as well, because technology offers great potential to support them in their journey in continued professional development, in bolstering their confidence, in making assessments, particularly if it's a non-specialist area for them that they're delivering training or assessments within. There's some really interesting examples here. So boosting confidence in teachers' ability to deliver professional judgments, otherwise known as centre assessed grading, which is a big thing in the school sector at the moment in the absence of exams. There's some fantastic work that's been done by a company called RM using comparative judgment as an approach that really empowers the teacher to make standardized, self-standardizing grading decisions around work that students have done. There's also a project being run by a Canadian company called Vreta in partnership with NASBIT, who are an association focused on supporting initial teacher trainers, to bolster confidence in maths. So maths is one of those subjects where there's almost a cultural permission not to be fantastically good at it. And I know when I was training to be a primary school teacher and indeed working as a primary school teacher, I was constantly aware that I was only a couple of steps ahead of the students with my own math skills. And that didn't instill me with great confidence in my ability to teach maths as a non-subject specialist in that area. This program that this company Vreta and NASBIT are doing is focused on bolstering those teachers' confidences in teaching maths and using an online platform to help deliver that. And again, details on all of these projects are shared in the notes of the slides that will follow the presentation. Finally, before I pass over to Dee, I just wanted to touch on a couple of quick examples of some other things that I've become aware of quite recently, where there's really innovative use of technology to support assessment delivery. Many of these projects have been spurred on by the challenges raised by the pandemic, but often they are about increasing accessibility or flexibility in the delivery of assessment, regardless of whether you're facing the challenge of a pandemic or not. The first example is the use of artificial intelligence to deliver a smartphone-enabled listening and reading learning component for a large English language proficiency test called the TOEIC test, which has in Korea and Japan alone 2 million learners annually, most of which are located in rural parts of particularly Korea, where they have to travel, the students have to travel quite long distances to get to a college or to a tutor to be supported in their learning and their formative assessment towards this TOEIC exam, which is a 2.5-hour exam, high stakes exam. So what's been achieved, mostly spurred on by the pandemic, but as I say, also to deal with general accessibility issues, is delivering the learning in a personalized way using AI to inform that personalization on smartphones. And interestingly, what they've noticed is a significant increase in learning impact. So learners achieving more as a result of being able to interact with this learning in a more personalized and direct way through a technology that they're very familiar with. And the other big benefit, which the students in Korea have really liked, is the fact that it saves the students lots of money because they're not having to travel to and from a training institution in order to receive this training. So really interesting project. Again, a link to that will be in the notes that follow this presentation. There's also some early work being done by a university down in Tasmania, working in partnership with another company to try and extract meaning from some of the learning data that's captured from virtual learning environments to understand the broader learning journey that a student is making in their quest to gain a particular credential, whether that's a degree or a micro credential, a badge in a particular area. I think this is a really interesting piece and sits very well and complements the e-portfolio approach I was talking about earlier on, because getting a richer understanding of students' broader capabilities is a really useful thing in the modern employability landscape for those students, making them more employable and giving them evidence of the learning that they've undertaken. So some really interesting work being done down in Tasmania around this. Closer to home for me anyway, in Bolton College in the northwest of the UK, is a really interesting project that's using artificial intelligence to try and help and support teachers in the assessment of open-ended responses to assessment questions that are open-ended by their nature, and also to provide quick and responsive feedback to students in that context too. Really interesting.
Breakfast, you stayed up late.
Wi-Fi off, Wi-Fi off.
You didn't even get
Wi-Fi
up.
off.
We've got someone who isn't muted if there's someone talking in the background.
Why?
I think that's perfect. Thank you very much for muting your microphone. And then the other project I quickly want to talk a little bit about is one that I think has great potential for the use in the workplace for measuring and assessing practical skills. So this particular example, which comes from an organization called CooperCon, is looking at supporting the practical assessment of medical skills in the university sector through something called Objective Structured Clinical Examinations, or OSCEs. Now, this has been really difficult to be delivered during the pandemic because the way an OSCE works is the student turns up and they're asked to progress through a number of practical workstations where there are actors simulating being the patient or being a clinician, and the student has to diagnose what's wrong with the patient, make the right decisions, and then move on to the next scenario. That all historically is related to very practical face-to-face interactions. What the organization CooperCom have done is deliver that remotely using video conferencing to support that and to deliver a structured progression through a number of assessments, which I think is fascinating, really interesting, and potentially very exciting for the workplace assessment scenario, where you're trying to understand the assessment of practical skills in the workplace, which has again been difficult through the pandemic. So some really interesting stuff there. The final one I wanted to touch on is the use of virtual reality. And there are a number of examples that I've come across in the last 12 months which illustrate how powerful this technology can be. So virtual reality allows the learner to be immersed into a learning scenario where they can interact with their environment and be posed a number of different challenges through that virtual environment. Been particularly helpful through the pandemic, where students haven't been able to go into a workplace to undertake a particular assessment, but also in generally supporting the learning process. And again, some really nice examples here. So one from the awarding body NCFE CASE in supporting students training to be midwives, where they can engage with the scenario of a pregnant lady and understand the process and get into the process that's going on within the body to understand how that's all working and to be assessed against those things. There's also an example from an organisation called CBOT XR down in Winchester in the UK that is using that technology to support the training of crew on ships dealing with emergency situations. And then an example that I know NEBOSH is working on at the moment in using VR as a mechanism to support the training of health and safety, approaches to health and safety within the workplace. So really, really interesting examples of how technology is being used to support that assessment process. I'm going to be quiet now and pass over to Dee, who's going to talk a little bit more about how NEBOSH have transitioned from closed book to open book assessment. So Dee, over to you. I will move you on to your slide.
Matt, thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to share our journey with you all. As has been said in introduction, my name's Dee and I'm the Chief Operating Officer with NEBOSH, and we're an awarding body that we deal primarily in health, safety and environmental qualifications, and we work with learning partners across the globe. So those qualifications are delivered not only in the UK but globally across the world. So like everyone else in the education and assessment space, in March last year, we were significantly impacted by the pandemic. And one of the main reasons for that is in March last year, we were at the very early stages of moving to digital assessments. So the majority of our qualifications in March last year were at least in part assessed by an examination that relied on invigilation. So all of those examinations, as the lockdown restrictions came into place in different stages across the world, that they were affected. They were cancelled, they were postponed, and that meant, sadly, thousands of our learners were stranded partway through their qualifications that they'd worked so hard to achieve. So we obviously needed to respond to that. And the obvious starting place for us to do that was with our highest registered qualifications, which was the National General Certificate and our International General Certificate. So that qualification requires about 10 days of taught content and had at that point 2 assessments, one of which was a practical risk-based assessment where the learners were required to do a risk assessment of the workplace and produce a report on the outcomes of that. So that part of the assessment qualification could still go ahead. The assessment that was impacted was the examination that relied on that venue sitting. So that was the one that we needed to look for either an adapted assessment for or some variant, along the lines that Matt has been speaking to us all about. So that became a strategic priority for the organisation. We needed to look at what our options were, but our priorities were very, very clear. We needed something that our learners could complete and progress without any further disruption. So we needed to bring in that change very, very quickly. But we needed also to ensure that whatever we brought in was equally valid, was equally reliable, had generalizability, and also very importantly, didn't impact on our learners or our learning partners. So our learning partners, like ourselves, were dealing with all the challenges of the pandemic. They were furloughing staff, they were restructuring. They couldn't go ahead with face-to-face learning, so many of them were adapting all their delivery mechanisms. So we were very mindful that whatever we did, we needed to make sure we weren't adding to their challenges. And also, very importantly, as Matt has been emphasising, the learner is at the heart of what we do. So we needed to make absolutely sure that whatever we did actually allowed them to complete their learning journey and gain their qualification, but without putting any additional challenge on what they're already signed up to. And finally, on this slide, before we move to the next one, again, at the core of that for us as a regulated awarding body, we needed to make sure that we gained SQA approval, which is the Scottish Qualifications Authority, our regulator. So the next one, please, Matt. So to do that, we worked very early on with our regulator. We had a preliminary meeting with them on the 1st of May last year, and we were really sense checking where they were in response to the pandemic. We have an excellent relationship with the SQA, and they were already responding from their end to the challenges of the pandemic. So their committees that meet to approve any changes to qualifications, to assessments, were already meeting more regularly to help awarding bodies through this period. And they were very open to alternative and adaptive assessments to help those stranded learners. So we had a decision to make at that point to whether or not we were just going to bring in an interim solution to see us through the pandemic and the lockdown restrictions. But again, linking back to Matt's presentation earlier, what I firmly believed was that the pandemic and this pause on the assessment actually gave us that chance to step back and revisit the assessment. So if we were going to put all this additional time, resource, and work into producing a replacement assessment, why not just do the extra step and make sure that anything that we changed, we actually changed for the better. And that was one of the key reasons that we chose to bring in a permanent alternative assessment, and one of the key reasons that we went for the open book assessment. So we are a vocational awarding body. We work very hard with all of our assessments to try and make sure that they don't just assess knowledge, they do assess that application of knowledge in the workplaces. And this was one of the benefits of moving to the open book assessment for us. It allowed us to actually increase the validity of the assessment in that sense, to really make another step change from the invigilated examination, where there is a reliance on memory, to the open book assessment, where the learners could access their textbooks, access the course notes and any other material available. Now, various challenges came with that. One was easily resolved in that we wanted to make sure that we were still assessing exactly the same talk content, the same learning outcomes, the same assessment criteria. So we lessened that burden on the learners, the learning partners, as I said earlier. So we wanted to give them that assurance that their preparation, the revision would be absolutely the same level and challenged. We just need to be aware that we're being assessed in a different way. But we also faced the challenge that if this is open book, it's easier. That was the social media noise that we were faced with when we initially put it out there that this was the route that we were going. So we were very clear from the beginning in our guidance to the learners, to the learning partners and other stakeholders that this is not an easier option. And we were very specific in our presentation to our regulator on that as well. So the format that we proposed to our regulator for this assessment was that we would be producing a work-based context, a scenario, and the questions that the learners will ask would all relate back to that scenario. And the form of questioning that we used for that and continue to use is the Socratic Approach. So that meant that we were able to very clearly state that a learner would not be able to pass this assessment by scouring the internet, scouring the notes and cutting and pasting answers. What they would be required to do is show their ability to access that information, assimilate that information. And this is where Matt was talking about these higher order skills, and then demonstrate to us that they could use those higher order skills to answer the questions in relation to the scenario that they were given. We chose to give them a 24-hour window to do that, although the estimate was that it would actually take 5-6 hours for the average learner to complete the questions that they were asked. But we chose the 24-hour window so we could do the assessment and reach all the learners across the globe that wanted to access this assessment. And we gave an approximate word count of 3,000, so the learners knew how many words they needed approximately to achieve a reasonable pass for this assessment. And the next one, please, Matt. Thank you. So I'm very pleased to say that in actually an unprecedented time, we got this approved by our regulator. It was formally proposed to them on the 13th of May. It went to their committee for approval on the 13th of June. and we were able to deliver our first open book examination in August of last year. So the timelines were unprecedented. We remain extremely grateful to the regulator for working with us on this approach. And whenever I talk about, this journey, I can never not say what an incredible achievement it was by the team at NEBOSH. People did absolutely come together in a very challenging time and deliver, a phenomenal piece of work. So once we got it approved by our regulator, the next challenge was how we made it accessible to the learners. So our technical team were on the ball with this. They partnered up with eThink to deliver the assessment via a Moodle platform. So this wasn't a digital assessment in the fullest sense that it was actually taken online. What we allow our learners to do is to log into the Moodle platform at the beginning of the 24-hour period, download the question paper, and then they work on it offline, complete their answers, and then upload at any time within that 24-hour period. They also then tick a box to confirm it is their own work. So this is one of the areas that SQA were very keen to explore with us, to make sure that we had all the right checks and balances in place to make sure that the learner that was submitting the work, we were sure that it actually was their own and only their own work. Another check and balance we put in place was that we wanted to make sure this was accessible to every learner anywhere in the world. So for our first assessment, a learner, even with a mobile phone, could download the assessment, handwrite their answers, take photographs of it and upload those photographs. So we were really making sure it was accessible to every learner and no learner was left behind. And final requirement from our regulator, again, to really demonstrate that authenticity of the learner, was a closing interview. So this doesn't form part of the actual assessment, but it is a box that needs to be ticked before we award the qualification. So what we ask our learning partners to do once the learners have completed their assessment is the learning partners log on to the Moodle platform. They have access to their own learners' scripts, and then they conduct a one-to-one closing interview with that learner. And what we supply the learning partners for that interview is a set of questions that really allow the learning partner to drill down and sense check that the answers given in the learner's script is their own. So, for example, we might have asked a question on suitable control measures for a particular hazard in the workplace. The learning partner then might drill down in the closing interview and ask them why they chose those particular three, or why, or of those three, what would be the most significant and why. So they're really checking the learner's understanding, and that allows them to make that call. Did the learner submit that answer or not? If they've got any doubt, then that is raised with us as a potential malpractice or maladministration, and we will follow that through with a full malpractice investigation. So that was one of the biggest challenges I think we had on this journey, the challenge of malpractice, and by it being an open book format, it potentially makes it more open to that challenge. And the next one, please, Matt. And Matt kindly put this one together for me. I won't take credit for this. This just shows the number of registrations that we've had since launch. So when we ran the first one in August of last year, we were anticipating a total registration of around 4,000 to 5,000 learners, which would have covered those that we knew were stranded. So we were pretty astounded when we got 8,609 registrations to that first sitting. We then set out a roadmap of assessments every other month, and you could see the increase in the second open book sitting. That was right up there, plus 38%, 13,883 learners. And it continued around that number until our most recent one, which literally just happened last week, where we had 15,890 learners. So I think that success speaks for itself. I do believe, we've risen to the challenges of the pandemic, and we've risen to the challenges that do come with changing an assessment format. we've had some incredible feedback from our learners. And that includes, which has been a real issue of mine for as long as I've been involved in education and assessment. And it links into what Matt was saying, that, you know, assessment shouldn't be done to learners. It should be part of the learning journey. And a good assessment, I believe, actually helps continue that learning. And that is exactly the feedback that we've had from our learning partners and our learners as well. You know, so to get that feedback that they've actually enjoyed an assessment and that they believe it's contributed to their learning was real music to my ears. So we are monitoring our registrations. We still keep expecting those numbers to drop. They haven't yet. But I do believe, you know, this potential new assessment is opening the doors to more learning partners, more learners. And as I say, we wait and see whether those registrations continue. Just one final number to leave you with. We actually achieved a year's worth of registrations in 6 months. And again, that is credit to the teams, you know, the colleagues that I work with, that they were able to facilitate and deal with that. And it goes back to making sure that the learner is at the heart of what we do. So that's quite a quick run through, a high level view of our journey, but I'm just mindful we needed to leave some time for questions, which I know Matt and I will be very open to take in at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Dee. And as I say, I suppose just to pick up on some of those bits at the end there, you know, this really is about trying to use technology to improve the process for the learner. That's got to be at the heart of any innovation in this space, I think. Yes, technology offers the opportunity for there to be greater efficiency, to be more resilient, in terms of assessment delivery, but at its heart, it's got to be about making sure that we're benefiting the learner. And that's where hopefully we've given you some insight into some examples where that's the case. The final thing I wanted to say before I pass back to Mary for questions is, you know, if you are interested in finding out more about some of the examples I've spoken about and other examples of best practice, I mentioned the Assessment Association at the beginning of the presentation. The website for the Assessment Association is e-assessment.com. Please do join and become a member. As I say, it's free to join. But every year the association runs an international e-assessment award, which is about looking through a number of different category lenses at best practice within the sector. Go to the website, have a look at some of the finalists and winners from previous years. Really good examples there of how technology is already being used to deliver and support assessment. But at that point, I'll stop. Very happy to open the floor to questions. I'll pass back to Mary. If you've got questions that you want to ask us individually offline, our details are on the screen. But Mary, thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk, and any questions from the audience, very happy to field those now.
You're very welcome. Thanks to both of you. That's absolutely fascinating. There were lots of questions that popped into my mind, particularly this idea that we're still, you know, decades on having this conversation about the fact that we want our assessment in, you know, the majority of instances to improve learning as well and to be driven by learning. And yet still we look at policymakers and, you know, we know that our own Mr. Williamson here in England has already, you know, pledged to, you know, keep, you know, ploughing that furrow of exams. So it is really interesting to see, because I hope we can use this as a learning opportunity. We've got some really interesting questions coming up in the chat, and the first one's from Leslie, and I think this is a terrific question, because it does make us think about those kind of you know, construct variances that can impact test takers' experiences. And Leslie asks, does the open book assessment require a greater degree of literacy from the learner?
Thanks, Mary. That's a great question. No, it doesn't. So in all of our qualification specifications, we will set, you know, we do set a literacy level. So that was key to us, that we didn't put any additional challenge either in literacy level or content or additional learning outcomes on the learners. So no, but a great question.
Oops, sorry, I got a bit distracted there reading the other questions because they're coming in there thick and fast. So, right, okay. Question for Dee from George McBride. Thank you, George. Was the scenario in the assessment prescribed in detail for all students, or could they adapt it in detail to match their own work context, c.g. local safety regulations, for example?
Another great question, thank you. No, all the questions were based on the scenario that was given in the question paper. So that's where the time and the resource goes in from our end to make sure that it is internationally applicable. So sometimes we do produce two question papers for the same sitting. One will be a national variant, one will be an international variant, to make sure that no learner anywhere is disadvantaged by that. The way the questions are answered does allow for individual interpretation. So a learner would not be disadvantaged if they'd answered a question of a particular culture or a particular country's set of rules and regulations. So the way the syllabus and the learning outcomes are set actually allow for those differences. But yeah, the scenario is set as part of the question paper, and then the questions all relate back to that scenario, and the learners need to demonstrate their ability to apply their knowledge to that scenario.
Building on that, thank you. So a question from Robert Solway, who says, you mentioned in developing a new form of assessment, one of the aims was to ensure that the same constructs were being assessed. So given the legacy version required recall of knowledge and the new one does not, have you been able to validate the extent to which the assessment does assess the same constructs?
That's a great question. Yeah, it does assess the same constructs. So the previous examination wasn't just knowledge based. I probably didn't make that clear. The open book assessment allows us to assess those higher order thinkings in a much clearer and better way. The way we did it before, we were still trying to do that. They couldn't really pass the written examination just from a knowledge base. They did still have to demonstrate some application in the previous format. Again, it's a great question because it's one thing our regulator challenged us on as well, and it was about the generalizability of the open book assessment, not just the generalizability between sittings of the new format of assessment, but generalizability between this and the previous format. So the method that we put to SQA to help do that was the Angoff method. So literally every sitting at the moment, we are applying a panel that will apply the Angoff method to show that generalizability between assessments, and to make sure, just say it's still assessing those same core constructs.
That's great, thank you. That really clarifies it. Tracy's got an interesting question about training the assessors in terms of devising open book assessments using higher order thinking skills. She's asked, did assessors receive training? And I'm sure she wants to know sort of what kind of training.
Yeah, and these are all fabulous questions. Yes, they did. So we already had, a huge pool of examiners that we used for all of our other assessments. And the majority of the assessors for the open book examination were sourced from that pool. But we did produce online training. So they were retrained in how to apply the marking criteria and the mark schemes for the new open book examination, and that subtle change and shift to those higher order skills. So yeah, we did do that online. One thing I didn't mention in the presentation that is another huge advantage of using the Moodle platform is that even though we're not fully using the digital assessment, the learners are just accessing and uploading. What it has allowed us to do, we're now marking online. And that, again, has got huge advantages for the learner, because instead of scripts being sent out manually to examiners, having to come back and so on, now the examiners are accessing the script literally the day after the examination has been sat, which in today's technology and digital advancement, it sounds like it should be a given, but for us, when we were so used to the paper trail and scripts going out and coming back in, it was astounding that we were seeing the learners' scripts the day after they'd sat the examination. So yeah, and further to that question on the training, Mary, what we do as well is we've done a higher level of mark review, because it is a new way of assessing and a new way of structuring the mark schemes. We have done a high level of mark review to check the reliability of marking.
That's great, thank you. Gabriel Cipriano has asked, this actually sort of builds on this about incorporation of technology to assess students and improve assessment value and use. He asked, do you think schools, teachers and students are ready for those changes?
I think it's a very good question, and I think probably the answer to that varies a little bit by sector. I mean, I think certainly NEBOSH's experience seems to suggest that students are ready and are looking to embrace this kind of change. I think that, you know, I mean, as with any kind of change, it has to be supported. It has to be implemented in a way that people feel that they're being taken on that journey and in a supported and structured way. I think probably the answer, the simple answer to that question is no. I don't think everybody is ready. I think different stakeholders groups will be ready at different stages. I do think students are ready for this change, the vast majority of students. And I think, you know, if we go back to the point that we made earlier on in the presentations about this all being about the learner, then that should give us the motivation to make this change. Whether schools and teachers and educational institutions as a whole are ready, I suspect they're not completely ready. I think, and certainly the examples I've seen suggest that there are definitely areas that are ready, and the groups of schools and groups of teachers that are ready for this. But for me, the one thing that's missing in a lot of this change is the support from a political point of view. You know, schools and teachers are busy and they won't change their processes until they're either told to change them, which isn't necessarily the most positive way to go about it, or they see a reason to change, moving from what they're doing now and spending all their time managing that to something else, and that it's going to be valued at a political arena. And that's the big challenge for me, is that there's really good examples, as we've talked about here, of where technology can make an impact. But I'm not sure the politicians are necessarily listening to that debate or necessarily understand that. And as they drive education policy, particularly here in England, that's a challenge for us. But if you look at one very quick last thing on this one, if you look at the example I mentioned right at the beginning of the national tests in Wales, you know, there's an example of what you can achieve if all the stakeholders buy into it. You know, and I'm not saying that the schools and teachers were ready at the very beginning for this, but I know from listening to previous presentations and reading case studies about that project, that because the government got behind it, and because it was rolled out in a way that people understood why it was being done, that everybody has now got behind it and it's being used to maximum effect.
Okay, thanks for that, Matt. And I think this is an ongoing issue. There's some really interesting comments in the chat too in relation to this about, you know, the fact that we have all been, you know, even in higher education too. If you'd asked me 18 months ago, would most of my colleagues be happy with the change, the rapid pace of change to moving our entire system online, I would have said no. And it has been a struggle, just as it has been in schools, I think, with people having to learn new ways of working. You know, we've had to revise our entire pedagogy and think about, what does teaching and learning look like now? What does assessment look like now? So I think that's really important that we keep having these conversations about the role of teachers, the professional context too, and you know, literacy and identity as well, I think, are so important.
Mary, just one more very quick comment on that. And I think the other thing I would recommend when people are thinking about making change is don't try and make wholesale change in one foul swoop. You know, try and find the use case or the example that can benefit from the technology change, and try it there first, where there's a demonstrable need for some sort of change, rather than saying, right, we're all going to change, all of our practice in one fell swoop, because that's, you've got to think about e-assessment technology. I think it's a bad example, but you've got to think of it as a pencil. You don't use a pencil for everything. You use it for certain things that you want that a pencil is good at doing. And you've got to think about e-assessment in exactly the same way. It's a tool. You use it where it's appropriate to be used.
Yeah, really good point too. Right, we've got quite a few questions and about 4 minutes left. So I'm going to just pick out a couple that are things that are slightly different to some of the things we've discussed. Neil Hardy asked an interesting question. Did the learners choose their own sources, or were they given a reading list they could work from?
They could choose their own sources. So within the qualification specification, specific reading materials and sources within that to support the talk content. But in terms of actually taking the open book assessment, they could source anything that they wanted. But what we were very clear about in our guidance to the learners and the learning partners is that because they had that open source, it would be too much to actually start the preparation of that on the day. So we very much encourage them to prepare and revise in advance. And I think this is one of the challenges we had with changing this assessment, is that there was a perception that it could all just be accessed on the day. They didn't need to revise. This was an easier route to a qualification. And of course, they found when they actually started to see the way the questions and the scenario worked, that wasn't possible. They did need to still hold some knowledge and some information, or some very quick ways to access the right information at the right time. Yeah, another great question.
I also think this would be good just to open up a little more, because I know you were constrained, as we all are, by time in these things. Zita has asked about, could you elaborate a little more about the marking process, your rubrics, moderation, and so on? Is it possible to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so when we design the question paper with the scenario and the questions at the same time, it's pretty much a point-based mark scheme that sits alongside that. So there is a structure to the marking criteria that the examiners receive. As I said, there was examiner training for all the examiners that we were using. And then we have what we call a team leader structure. So our more experienced examiners are appointed as team leaders, and they carry the responsibility for mark review. So, as I say, we really increased the amount of mark review that we did. And the way that works is a team leader will have access to an examiner's batch of scripts, and they'll initially sample 3 of those across a range of marks. And of course, the benefit here, this is another benefit of technology and online marking, we were able to do that real time, whereas previously our moderation mark review had been end of the marking process. So if an issue was found, it was found at the end of the examiner's marking, and we had a whole batch of scripts to unpick. Whereas because the team leaders can now access real time, they can access when an examiner's maybe only marked 5, 6, 10 scripts. So it's a much more proactive and effective process.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've got 1 minute left. I'm going to try and find just one more final question. Well, I think that's a really interesting question. Can we have real dynamic online assessment without having good websites and good high-tech facilities?
It's a great question. I think it was our 2nd or 3rd open book exam, and this is where technology is challenging. We thought we'd done everything we needed to do with our Moodle partner to cater for the peaks and troughs. So obviously what happens in the open book scenario, at the opening of the 24-hour window, everybody's on the site trying to get the question paper, and the same at near the end of the 24 hours. And I think it was our 3rd one, even though we thought we'd done the right checks and balances, it overloaded the system. and the system was down for about an hour. Now that's been rectified since, and this is where I'm not an IT person, but apparently there's things that can be done to help that, and that's now being done. But yeah, it's one of the, you know, the warnings of technology, that it's great until it's not. But yeah, that created a real headache for us. The learners were all able to, you know, obviously get online an hour later, but then we had to give a lot of thought to special consideration, and, you know, if they've been disadvantaged, and how that all, you know, measured up in the marks were finally awarded to cater for that. But yeah, yeah, technology is great, and so much innovation has come out of the challenges of the pandemic. But yeah, we do need to be mindful that we do take the advice, really, that Matt said, try not to do too much at once.
That's great. I think that's a really good point to end on as well, is kind of understanding our limitations too. You know, we can't do everything, much as we would like to. And I think, you know, certainly my feeling is I'm often told off for being a Pollyanna. And those of you who don't know what that is, it's someone who's always imagining the glass is half full and everything's okay. But I like to see this as an opportunity, as learners and as teachers and educators and whatever else we might be, researchers. You know, there are so many opportunities opening up to us at the moment, and assessment is just, I think, one of the most fascinating areas to be working in and researching in at the moment. So I would like to, on behalf of AEA Europe and from UCL as well, who host this series for us, thank you very much to Dee and Matt for such an interesting session. The chat, just to let you all know, what I'll do is I save this and I'll send it to the presenters and ask them to add any answers or further things comments they might have to you. And when we send you all the a link to the actual recording, we'll also add a copy of that as a Word document so you can have a look. That'll be in the next week or so, because term is just starting for me, so please bear with me. I'll be as fast as I can. But there will be another webinar in May, details of that coming up soon, and AEA Europe also has the Assessment Culture Special Interest Group. They've also got a SIG webinar coming up next month, so do have a look on our website too. But thank you all very much for coming, and hope you all enjoyed it. Take care of yourselves and each other, and we will see you all very soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mary.
Matt and Dee, do you want to just stay on for a minute or two? Let me just have a quick debrief. Sorry, the front door's going now.
It's all right. Well timed.
Yeah. Won't be a sec. Sorry, nearly there.
Is that the sound of you booting people out one by one?
Yes. I don't know how you boot as a whole, but everyone is booted now.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
You're still recording?
Lovely.
We are
Thanks.
still
That was
recording.
terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And we could have done a couple of hours there. I think we always
Yeah.
can with these. So I hope you found it useful.
That was great. It's great to get such a good response and a question. You know, really great